Welcome to our Nerds at Church June 2022 live Q&A. I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
Just a couple heads up for folks who are joining us and folks who may be watching this or listening to this afterwards.
Once we become spectacularly successful and listened to around the world.
Yes, exactly, or something like that. I do think we are listened to a little bit around the world, at least in Canada.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Just so an FYI, this is being recorded, obviously. We have it set up so that Kay and I are visually recorded and audibly recorded. If you say something, you will also be recorded. If you don't want your voice on the recording, then you can type in the chat and we will respond that way. And this is an episode that includes swearing, so warning for that. And we have at least one question about J.K. Rowling. So if you don't want to hear about her, you can skip that, but you also might want to hear what we might say to her. So,
sure.
Yeah.
So we have a list of questions to start with, and then if anybody has any questions to add, please just ask or type them in the chat, and we'd be happy to pop those in too, as well as we can.
Yep.
Oh, and I feel like I should announce Maggie, the podcast mascot, is probably sitting in my chair in the living room right now and is not likely to give that up without a fight. So I don't think we'll be seeing her tonight, but she says hello.
Yes, and special thanks to our super techie genius, Nerds at Church tech girl, part of the Diaconia Faith Collective, Susanna Porter, who is making our technology happen today.
Thank you, Susanna. So, Emily, how did Nerds at Church come to be?
So, originally, I was listening to the Witch Please podcast and the HP and the Sacred Text, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text podcasts. Those are kind of my introduction to podcast listening back in 2016. And Witch Please had one of their like kind of off topic episodes was a thing they did at like a college or something. And they were on a panel and they were talking about like what it takes to podcast and how important it is for people who are not cishet white guys to podcast.
Yay.
Yeah. And so I was like thinking about it and thinking about what I would podcast about. And then in one of the clergy groups that both Kay and I are in, somebody posted something about podcasting and I commented and I was like, I would totally do a podcast about like Harry Potter and the Bible or the church or something, but I don't want to do a podcast on my own because I knew that was going to be like too much work. Yeah, I don't even remember which group it was in, but
I'm not sure offhand. We could probably go back and try to search the clergy groups, but honestly, I have almost no luck doing that with keywords and stuff anymore. Facebook changed the algorithm and now it barely works. But yes, Emily put up a post asking and I responded. And it was not long after that I found myself unemployed and with a lot of free time on my hands. And so suddenly the podcast was able to get going a lot faster. I was reasonably comfortable with the idea of doing the sound editing edge of things because while I didn't actually have any experience with that, my dad was actually a AV guy for his entire career, and the old-fashioned kind. He did not, to my knowledge, actually use sound editing computer software all that much. He was much more a soundboard kind of guy, and video production. And so he has been able to answer various questions because the terms for stuff are mostly still the same, and I can use the terms from, say, the Audacity program, which is what I use to do the sound editing. And he's able to give me some tips that usually point me in the right direction for how to fix the problem, which has been handy a few times now. So
yes, and I was up for doing the social media, which I think both of us have had a significant learning curve on, like, how to how to social media and how to audio.
Yes.
But yeah, and it kind of grew out of that. And we were HP at church for several years.
2.5, I want to say. We did not get the
yeah.
full lectionary round. We did not get to
we were
full
close.
years, but
and then we just had, I in particular just had too much of J.K. Rowling, and
no one can blame me.
Yeah, she had always been a subtle turf, and then it was like in 2020 just started being full turfdom, colonialism,
etc.
Awful, yeah. And so it was getting harder and harder for me to prep for each episode. And so then we talked about it, and we took a break. We decided to take a break. We took a break in August, and then...
Excuse me, I believe the correct term for that is sabbatical.
Yes, we took a sabbatical. I usually think of sabbaticals as things that are paid. So I don't know that either of us have ever had a sabbatical in our combined...
My mom did. She was the one administrator at Northern Illinois University to ever have one. But,
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we took a sabbatical, did kind of a reset, and then birthed Nerds at Church to start in Advent year B, so in 2020. And that was exciting because we're starting with the new church year, and so now it's a real easy each season, but also we get to use all sorts of different nerdery, and we get to have deep dives and guests, and I think it's been a really great shift for us as a podcast.
Absolutely.
Really
I also love that the episodes are shorter because I spend a lot less time being angry at my computer while sound editing. Less patience involved.
Yes. And we have like more stuff that we can actually give patrons on Patreon. Like,
absolutely.
To have guests means we now have uncut episodes because both of us can talk a lot.
Not that anyone would ever guess that.
Right. It's not like we have podcasts where that's literally what we do. Yeah. So that's kind of like the origin stories of Nerds at Church.
Oh, and I think one other interesting tidbit is that we did not know each other before we started doing this together. We had bumped into each other in the clergy Facebook groups once or twice and probably took part in the same conversations, but we've met in person exactly once so far for lunch. And otherwise, we have mostly been across state lines from each other and low on gas money, and therefore have done everything via the internet.
Yeah. It was fun to actually meet each other because part of it wasn't just that Kay left her call, but both of us left our calls at almost the exact same time, or left our jobs.
Timing was extraordinary.
Yeah. So it was the weird things the spirit does when we think something sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
hi, I'm Aaron Holmgren, pronouns are he, him. I had a quick follow-up question of, you met for lunch. Was that primarily for the sake of the podcast, or was it a church-wide event? What brought that lunch together?
That was just us.
Yeah. I was driving through, so I was serving in southeastern Minnesota while Kay was serving in southwestern Minnesota. Since then I've moved multiple times, but I was driving through to the Twin Cities or somewhere near there. And so I stopped at Kay's, or maybe I was driving to Canada.
You weren't actually in town where I live, but you were driving through a fairly near one, and we both figured, of course, we should meet up because we haven't before, and it's a fairly short drive for me. And so my husband had spent some time in the town that you were passing through, and he was able to recommend a place that you could probably get good vegetarian food. And I have learned that my stomach will eventually digest almost anything, so I wasn't terribly concerned about myself. And we got to have lunch, and it was lovely to meet you. And I think the only actual comment I remember was that I was a little taller than you expected. Yes. But I get that a lot. So.
Yeah, we did take a picture.
Yes, it's kind of hilarious.
It was,
it's somewhere in our Facebook newsfeed, I'm sure.
It is. I think it's still in our, if nothing else, it's in our hp@church.wordpress.com
oh, man,
website that
yeah.
I don't think have ever taken down completely. That's okay. Yeah. So our next question that we got ahead of time is, what are your favorite Bible verses?
So I discovered mine when I was, I want to say like 8 or 9 years old, and I was doing the traditional small Christian child thing of flipping through the Bible and reading a random verse and seeing if it was going to tell me the future or something. And so therefore I swear that this isn't the fault of me being Lutheran, but it actually is from Romans chapter 8. And I guess that might have been a sign, I don't know. But Romans 8:21, the NRSV version is that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And I like that translation okay, but the original version that I read it in was actually in the NKJV, which mostly sucks. But the phrase that it used in this verse in particular was the glorious liberty of the children of God. And that is where my Twitter handle comes from. And I like that phrasing better. I don't know that it's a more accurate translation. I don't really care. I think it gives the idea better. And that's been central to my faith ever since. There is also a lovely bit near the end of Luke chapter 6 that I really like. That is right after the judge not, lest you be judged, but forgive and you will be forgiven, a good measure pressed down and shaken into your lap, something like that. It's God being generous and abundant, and I really like that one too.
Nice. I also had Romans 8 in my mind, but a little bit later. I know, weird. I really love Romans 8:26, and Romans 8:26-39 was one of my readings for my ordination. But likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And that's that passage in particular, from there to nothing can separate us from the love of God. It has always just been really big and really important in my life. It was one of the readings that I picked for my grandmother's funeral. It's just like, it's one of the readings that as a chaplain, I would always have ready if I was doing a blessing for a miscarriage or a stillbirth or something like that. So it's just always been like a very comforting one for
me. So Emily, who is your favorite biblical figure?
I love the Syrophoenician woman in Mark, or the Canaanite woman in Matthew, depending on which passage. Awesome. But she is awesome. She was the gospel reading for my ordination. She is fantastic. She has witty comebacks and bests Jesus in a game of like word wit. And I will never do that because I'm too slow at things, but I love puns and I love playing with words. So yeah. My favorite.
I think mine is the woman with the hemorrhage from Luke. She is bold. She goes after what she wants. She gets it. Jesus approves of her doing all of that. And she's just not at all the image that a lot of people like to give of Christian women. She's actually very much the image of Christian women that I grew up with, which is apparently unusual. But that, yeah, she's definitely a favorite. I also, when I was a little kid, I really loved the story of Esther from a very young age. She was just, she was very much a superhero. And
She's
then,
fantastic.
yeah, and then as I've gotten older, also, the story of Jonah is absolutely hilarious when you know what's going on. And I've really enjoyed that too. And I enjoy explaining that one to confirmation students.
Yes, for sure.
So.
And then touching back to our origins, who is your favorite Harry Potter character?
Well, I would imagine I might not be the only one to say this, but when I was originally reading the books as a kid, I started just after they first started coming out. Hermione was definitely my favorite. I identified very hard with her. But
Same.
as I've gotten older, I definitely have a deep abiding love for Minerva McGonagall, who is possibly one of the very few people in that school who actually should have been teaching. And I have always had, I was weird as a little girl in that I never had any expectation of growing up to be like a Fleur Delacour or anything like that. I always expected I would eventually grow up to be a Minerva McGonagall. Like the ancient terrifying battle axe was exactly where I expected to wind up one day. And I have had many people tell me I'm well on my way, so that's not bad.
Congratulations.
But yes, I love her a lot, and I've also really grown to appreciate Neville's character because he's not like that exciting, but he gets the job done, and nobody thinks he's worth anything at the start, and it turns out he's a very solid, reasonable guy, and that's great. So
yeah, I also definitely resonated with Hermione's character growing up, but my favorite was Ginny for a long time, mostly because I think I had a crush on her.
She also has a slightly different spirit to her than Hermione does.
Yeah. But I also really love Tonks, and in particular, like my understanding of Tonks as genderqueer, yes, and the possibilities for what that means about Remus's character and Remus and Sirius being decidedly in a relationship, and then like Tonks and Remus, and just kind of like all of these possibilities for queerness that were unintentionally written into those books.
Yeah. And a Metamorph Magus would be awesome.
Right?
Yeah. So in a parallel to one of our earlier questions, what is your least favorite Bible story?
Hosea, the rape of Tamar. There are so many terrible ones to pick from.
Yeah,
it's hard to decide, but those are definitely like pretty high up there.
Yeah, I definitely have a early ministry story of a Bible study gone terribly wrong that involved having the story of Elisha and the bears brought up unexpectedly, and kind of sidelining me because I was trying to like teach the concept of maybe we don't have to take the Bible entirely literally, and I had that story thrown at me as, well, Elisha asked God to send the bears to kill the children, and God did it, so God must have approved of that, right? And like there's no good answer to that question, especially when the person asking it is already convinced you're going to hell for unrelated reasons, which I don't have to get into. But yeah, that was an extraordinary evening. So yeah, I still haven't really figured out how to explain that one to anybody. But
there is this the I don't know if you, I think I've shown it to you. I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but the Bible according to D&D, like there's like if the Bible were a D&D game. Oh, and there's one that's
that would explain a lot.
Yeah, but I think the Alicia and the Bears is one of the options for it. But there's like a whole bunch where it's like where it is like, okay, so you're really, these kids are coming by and you're really annoyed, and Alicia's like, okay, do I have like divine intervention? Like what spells do I have? And just like escalates
summon bears. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Well, fine,
fantastic.
God, if you really love me, you'll let me have these kids mauled. Like, goodness knows I've had days like that. I just don't ask God to do things like that because I know better because I got to hear this story, right?
Yeah. I will try and find it if I can find it, and I'll share it. But
yeah, that would be super interesting.
And so if those are our least favorites, then what is your most favorite Bible story?
I kind of feel like I'm cheating for this one, but I already said the woman with the hemorrhage in Luke.
It's true.
There are lots of really good ones, I admit that, but yeah.
I love the story of the daughters of Zelophehad.
Yes.
Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milcah, Tirzah. I used them when I was in seminary. I took a January term course on faith-rooted organizing or faith-based community organizing, and they were one of the key ones. I had learned about them mostly on internship, and then I used them as my like evidence of community organizing in the Bible and the ways that they, instead of just like trying to get their like little slice of the pie, they were like, no, this is going to impact other people inevitably. So we're going to do it now, and we're going to do it big and in front of everybody. And then God was like, yeah, duh, Moses, they're right. And Moses still tried to like walk it back some, but their persistence and
yes.
Yeah.
That's one of the few stories that I try to make a point of telling during confirmation, because it's not one that is easy to point at because they show up a few different times in a few different places. And yet it is so vital to know that fighting for justice matters.
Yeah. And that's like, that was used for inheritance laws.
Yeah.
Like even in the United States, it was cited in court stuff, which is
Absolutely.
its own kind of like complicated religion and state thing. But yeah, it was a good precedence to set.
Yeah. So now we get to our J.K. Rowling question, which is, if you could have J.K. over for lunch, what food would you prepare for her, and where would you, what would you say to her about how awful she is?
Yeah. I would not prepare food for her because she is a really cruel and awful and oppressive person. But I would let her sit on our porch, which is like porch culture in Baltimore is like this whole thing, and I love it. And I might offer her like coffee, because we just always have coffee. I would offer
that's
her
like the
baseline
Lutheran expectation of like, I don't actively want you to die right now. So
I'd like maybe offer her coffee or water. And it's hard to say like what I would say to her, right? Because she's been told all of the things. She's been told how harmful her views are and how much they hurt people, and she doesn't care. And so I think I would instead tell stories of amazing transgender people, and like not private stories, right? Like public stories that are well known, but about transgender people thriving and trans people, you know, changing, like taking Harry Potter and making it their own, and trans people rejecting it, but trans people finding and thriving in their own lives in spite of her and others like her.
Yeah, well, the whole preparing food question is a little complicated for me. No one is really trusting me with that right now. When my ADHD blew up a couple years ago, we discovered that me preparing food was generally not a good plan, and it leads to disaster. But I suppose if I was going to eat, I would feel bad if I was sitting in front of someone else and they didn't have food. So I guess I can stop by Subway on the way, whatever. And as for what to say to her, I don't have any questions. Like, she has literally answered all of them in front of billions of people on Twitter. And So I guess your answer to that is a little more mature than mine, Emily, because what I did was I immediately went to Archive of Our Own, and I searched the Harry Potter fandom for stories with a trans character and sorted by kudos, and I found the most kudos story on AO3, and I have that in the doc. So if Emily wants to throw that in chat, I guess that's an option. I have no idea if the story is any good. Honestly, I haven't read it. I haven't been reading Harry Potter fan fiction for a while. I've moved on a bit, but if that many people love it, I suppose it's probably pretty good.
Yeah, and we'll include a link to it when the video posts for those of you that are watching or listening afterwards.
Yeah.
What is it called? Do you have what it is called though?
I believe it's actually called The Girl Who Lived. It's about Harry being trans.
The Girl Who Lived Again.
Yes.
By Dirge Without Music. Yeah. I like both of those as like options. Both of them are like trans people exist and trans people own.
And like, I realized that this question probably wasn't intended to sound like you have JK as a captive audience for a set period of time, have fun, but that's how I took it. So
I think knowing the person that submitted that question, I think it was a little bit of
maybe.
Another question, we're just gonna keep going unless you interrupt us or like raise your hand or something. So another question is, what are your call stories?
Well, I feel like I should mention Maggie has actually entered the room but is currently hiding from me, so we'll see if she decides to join us. I was like so many church kids, I did go to church camp. Luckily, I went to an ELCA camp, and those are a lot less scary than some of the ones that you may have heard of elsewhere. And I was doing a, oh, here she goes. I was doing a camp that was teaching you how to be a camp counselor. And you spent 2 weeks with them, and the first week you were a camper, and the second week you were an assistant counselor. And it was my first full day of being a camp assistant counselor, and we got to the hour that the assistants were off work. We had an hour off every day, just before supper or something. And I got to go up to the staff hangout building and use the phone for the first time. Maggie says hi. And I had been trying to get through to my best friend back home for several days by that point, because we were also allowed to use the phone over the weekend. And I finally got through to her for the first time, and I hadn't talked to her in a week and a half. And it turned out that one of our classmates had died in a car accident. I did not know him super well. Like, I knew his name, I knew him to say hi, but there were over 300 people in our class. I didn't know everybody, and I wasn't terribly well known myself. But she knew him quite well. They had gone to school together for many years. I hadn't gotten to that school district until 7th grade. And it hit her like a ton of bricks. And so I spent a half hour or so on the phone with her, trying to talk her through it. This was not the first unexpected tragic death she had had to deal with that I had been there for her during. It was a lot. And then she had to go, and I still had like half an hour of my time off before I had to go back and be with the kids again, which was probably good because going back right away would have been bad. And so there was a spot not far away from that building that was one of my favorite spots on the campus. That was this lovely limestone cliff that had a really spectacular view. And so I went over there, and I had a conversation where I yelled at God. And if you yell at God long enough, eventually sometimes God yells back. And the answer to that was that I should be a pastor. And that was both kind of a surprise and not entirely welcome. Like, I had been told for a decent chunk of my life that I was very smart and I could make very good money when I grew up. This was not really on my radar. And then as something I will be grateful for the rest of my life was that the first person I told, who was a friend at camp a couple days later, the first person I told about that conversation with God said that he thought I would be a good pastor. I have not talked to that guy in years, but I will always be grateful for that moment because it's helped me in my call at times when literally nothing else was except God. And then I just kept moving along with life. I figured, you know, if the whole pastor thing doesn't work out, I have other options. But every time I did something pastor related, anytime I took a step on the path, it just felt more and more right. And I knew more and more that this was what I was supposed to be doing. And that just never stopped. And every time I tried to do something else, I felt empty and like it was pointless and I wasn't fulfilled at all. So now I'm here.
Thanks. I also grew up going to church camps, Lutheran church camp. Shout out to Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp. And I grew up, my grandmother on my mom's side was Catholic, and she is actually the one who brought me to the sacraments. She is the one who brought me to baptism. I was baptized in her congregation, and then also she would when we would visit, she would take me with her to daily mass. She went to church every day but Sunday because she went to the Saturday evening Catholic service. So I was Lutheran, right? I was raised in the Lutheran church, but she also had a big influence in my life. And so growing up, once I gave up on being president of the United States, I wanted to be a youth director. And it wasn't until college that I figured out that I wanted to be a youth director, because though I knew that Catholics only let men be priests and that was bad, I hadn't actually translated to Lutherans let people of all genders be pastors. And at the time it was pre-2009, so there was extra complications there. But as I was like figuring out that I was feeling called to be a pastor, I also was doing a study abroad in Argentina and coming out to myself. And so when I got back from Argentina, I had 3 majors. I triple majored in Spanish, religion, and women and gender studies, because that is who I am. And so they were 3 majors. There were 3 things I was passionate about, but they also represented parts of my identity. And I had them and I was holding them all, and like, how do you balance all of this and be a pastor? Like, is it even possible? And one of our pastors, our campus pastors, was on the alumni board at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and so took us to the leadership conference that they did. And Pastor Heidi Newmark of Trinity Lutheran Church of Manhattan on the Upper West Side in Manhattan was preaching, and she talked about both the Syrophoenician woman and Zelophehad's daughters. But in her preaching, she talked about Mujeres en Progreso, the Latino women's support group, making dinner for the youth at Trinity Place, the transitional housing shelter for LGBTQ youth that was housed in her congregation's church basement. And that was kind of my 2x4 to the head from the Holy Spirit moment of like, look, all of these things are in one congregation. Like, you as your whole self can in fact be called to ordained ministry in your whole self. And so that kind of progressed, and I did young adults in global mission in Slovakia, and was entranced at the beginning of August of 2009. For folks who know the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America's history, the end of August 2009 is when policy changed around ordination for openly LGBTQIA+ people in same gender partnerships, which is all outdated language, but that was some of the language that was used then. And so in starting candidacy, I made the active decision to say that I had read Vision and Expectations, a document designed to keep queer people out of ministry, and then said that and then did not say that I would follow it because I was not willing to say no to love in order to be a pastor. And that has been hugely helpful for me in terms of my call, and recognizing that my call is not just to be a pastor. My call is also to love and to relationships. So that's my call story. And now I'm here.
Yes. So if money and audience, and presumably, I guess, anything else weren't an issue, what dreams do you have for the podcast, Emily?
I would have transcripts for everything. And I would probably do more I think we would do more Patreon stuff if we weren't responsible for doing like all of the logistical things that we're responsible for now.
Yeah.
So social media, like getting someone who wanted to do social media would be great for me. I like make it up, but I know there are ways to do it more effectively and stuff. Yeah, and potentially grow our Nerds at Church podcast empire.
Yeah. Well, not empire. I don't know that that's a word we want to.
It's true. It's not really an empire.
Yeah. I think my entire answer to that, in addition to what you said, Emily, would be paying someone else to do the sound editing. I do the sound editing because someone has to, and I'm reasonably competent at it. It's not the kind of task that it is designed for a person with ADHD. I don't consider myself especially skilled at it, even after all these years of practice. But if we did pay someone for it, then I could like start doing other stuff. Like I do actively enjoy making like those wacky little images on Canva that we use occasionally, and other things. I would be happy to help out with the social media more if we had somebody to do that kind of thing. So we'd have more options. And yeah, I agree that the people who do lots of stuff for their Patreon people are people who have like assistants for that. And we don't. So,
and who like get paid potentially for
the
actual
assistants get paid.
Right?
Like we love you, Susanna. You're great, but
yes, we are not paying our super techie genius. That is a labor of love, just as this podcast is, right?
Yes,
like
exactly. Yeah, all of the money that gets given to Nerds at Church goes to Nerds at Church and not us in particular.
Yeah, maybe someday, like if we get enough, I could do this as a job.
Yeah, I'm not against the idea, but it's going to involve a larger listening base considerably.
Yeah. Which, who knows? We're almost to 550 likes on Facebook.
Yeah, we're getting there.
No.
And we always have more than 50 and generally a few less than 100 listens every week. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, we have a pretty good listener base. We love our listeners.
We do. You're delightful.
And it's like with most things, it's not about actually like yes, it'd be great if it grew, but not just like for the sake of it being bigger and us making money. Like,
yeah, no, just getting to do more of the parts of it we actually like. And yeah.
Speaking of podcast, do you have one?
Yeah. Speaking of the podcast and elements that you like, this is just a very quick question, but who plays the violin for the intro?
That's not either of us.
Oh, really?
A friend of mine who married a friend of mine from college is Rachel Meyer-Laughlin. And she plays the violin. And when we were HP at church, we worked out I worked out the music for our intro for HP at church on a very, very like low. I don't have a ton of music theory education, but I was able to like photocopy the notes from. I think it was a little bit of Hedwig's theme and something else that we mixed together.
It was it was not the Magnificat, but it was like Mary.
It was
Mary, did you know?
yeah, it was What Child Is This? It was a Christmas Carol.
What Child Is This?
I went through, I looked at Hedwig's theme, and I found the key that it was in and the notes that it used. And then I started paging through the ELW, looking for a hymn that would kind of go with it. And What Child Is This was the first one. And it actually sounded pretty good when I sort of hummed it to myself. And so I wrote out the notes to combine the two. And Rachel had a little free time at the time and was able to record that for us. And then when we switched to Nerds at Church, Emily and I each picked one of our favorite themes from a sci-fi related thing. Mine was yes, go ahead.
I did Star Wars, I think.
Yes, and mine is the end of the theme from Star Trek Voyager. And then we, again, I looked at the keys that those two were in, and thankfully I was able to find a version of both that were in the same key. And I looked through the ELW, and this time Canticle of the Turning was one of the options, and we both said absolutely yes to that. And then Rachel was able to help out again, and that was delightful. I think for the HP at Church theme, Rachel had a friend named Gretchen, whose last name I have forgotten. We never actually met, who also played, but this time for Nerds at Church, it's just Rachel. So
yeah, Rachel Meyer-Laughlin is our
violinist, and we should probably do a annual. I think we do an annual shout out to her, like once a year, but
once a year because we
try to remember
the music or
but
use it. Yeah, but yeah, shout out to her.
She is delightful.
So another question that we have is, what are your favorite podcasts other than your own / Nerds at Church, obviously?
Now that I look at my list that I put together, none of these are church podcasts.
I do a lot of podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. I just noticed that as an interesting tendency. I don't I prefer reading stuff for work usually rather than listening. So lately I've been listening to a lot of Not Another D&D podcast, also known as NADDPOD, which is D&D campaigns. And I recently signed up for their Patreon, so now I have access to their Patreon content. So I'm currently zooming through that very quickly. But I also very much enjoy Three Black Halflings, and there's which is also a D&D podcast. There's a podcast that's a little harder to find now because she left Spotify because of the terrible thing Spotify was doing. It's called Fuckbois of Literature, and she literally interviews various people about classic lit and is this guy a horrible person? And exactly how is this guy a horrible person? And she has a hatred of Jane Eyre that is just amazing, which is the one thing I disagree with her about. But several of those episodes have been delightful and really freeing. And I also very much enjoy Stuff You Missed in History Class. That same cloud of podcasts used to have one called Stuff Mom Never Told You, which has kind of disappeared off the map lately, which was more feminist stuff. And then there's a podcast called Ologies, which is sort of every couple of weeks she does a major 3-hour deep dive into a topic. And she just recently finished a 3-part miniseries on ADHD that was very helpful.
Nice.
So
my go-to podcasts are All My Relations, which is a podcast run by 2 Native women talking about all my relations, which is a common phrase I know of from the Lakota in particular, but there are phrases like that or that phrase in a variety of different Native cultures. So they have a whole bunch of different things that they've talked about by now, and I have switched devices enough that I don't actually have my history of which episodes I've seen, so I just that's one of the ones that I pick based on which topic it is or how much time I have and how long the episode is. And then Witch Please is in the middle of a reboot, and so I've been listening to that and enjoying that. It's the only one left of the Harry Potter ones that I still watch, though Black Girls Nerd Out and Black Girls Create have like a couple different ones. They have Time and Relative Blackness in Space, so TARBIS, as well as Harry Potter and other fandom ones. And then I loved NB, just the letter N and the letter B. It was done by the BBC, and it was someone's process of like coming out as non-binary and then coming out to their family and then now what? And I forgot that I had been like saving the last episode. So I finally listened to the last episode. But it's really great, and it goes into like a lot of different aspects of gender, and it's based in the UK, but it's very relatable. And then I obviously love Horror Nerds at Church because I'm co-hosting it. So I don't know if that counts.
I think that just means you know how awesome it is.
Yeah.
You know,
and
not that we would ever, randomly put merch or anything into it.
Yeah, I just ordered my merch today, but I do have from when I won the pet costume contest for Horror Nerds at Church. But yeah, so our Vampire Twilight series of tearing apart Twilight for the good of everyone.
And the rest of us appreciate your effort. Absolutely.
Happy to be of service. And then I'm excited about my housemate Matt was talking about how did this get made?
I have heard good things.
He was talking about a particular episode that his coworker was talking about, or they listened to, or something, called The Night Before Christmas.
Okay.
Like the KNIGHT Before Christmas, which is a Netflix movie, which I've seen because Christmas movies, and it's terrible. And so, yeah, he was like going into it, and I was like, now I need to listen to that podcast. If nothing else, I will listen to that episode, but I might listen to more than just that as well.
Wonderful. So who would be a dream guest to have on the podcast?
I would love to have Rabbi Danya Rutenberg on the podcast. She is the rabbi of Twitter, is like one of the kind of monikers that she holds. She also is one of the people who was most integral to our newer segment on Nerds at Church of Let's Make a Muppets Musical. I'm willing to say that if it wasn't for her, we would not be still doing that.
Yeah. Segment. She was very instrumental.
Yep. That came from a Twitter conversation between Kay and her. And so, and she's brilliant. I would probably honestly have her in this particular time and place. I would want her to talk about abortion, actually.
Yeah.
Because she has some really great stuff on abortion. She also has some really great stuff on gender in Jewish scriptures, and like the 6 or 7 genders that exist in Judaism. And
to be entirely honest, I think she's one of the very few people I would say that I'd be happy to just tell her, look, when can you show up? We'll do an extra episode. It'll be fine.
Anything.
So that is a very short list.
Yeah. I think like I have dreams of like figuring out the exact right topic for a deep dive to actually ask her. So we might actually ask her. Who knows what she will say, or if
with any luck, she'll remember the Muppet conversation.
Maybe we still occasionally tag her.
Yes,
on Twitter on that. Or I would have one of the doctors, especially the more recent doctors, be on, because I think that would be fun too.
Yes. Well, okay. Now that you brought up the doctor, I have to ask, who is your doctor?
So my doctor originally was Matt Smith, because that's when I started watching. And then I went back through and watched, and I have paused. So I haven't seen past Peter Capaldi. I stopped during Peter Capaldi because I was like, I want to go back and listen to like all the old ones.
Sure.
And I moved, and it's hard to track down like which ones are older and which ones are newer, like the old ones, like what order, all of that. So I am waiting until I have a week where I'm not going to be busy, and then I'm going to get a trial of
2087.
Yeah. And then I'm gonna get a trial of the like BritBox,
Sure.
the BBC streaming thing, and just watch all of the old ones then, and
Sure.
then move forward from there. That's my theoretical plan, to catch up. But then on principle, my doctor is, well, I guess now she's not the newest one because there's a new one.
Yes, who also sounds awesome.
Yes, either of those two would be my doctors on principle. Because,
the one whose name you didn't say was Jodie Whittaker.
Yes.
Now, perhaps some of our guests can imagine the amount of editing I have to do to create coherent sentences for Emily on occasion. But
I'm not a names person.
Well, you did just fine. Yeah, I would say I mean, I think we've had a couple of dream guests already, to be entirely honest with you. And I'm not naming names because I don't want to leave anybody out. But if I could really dream big, I would say I would love to talk to Natalie Portman about both Padme and Jane Foster, and because particularly she does have a Jewish family connection, and the way that both Star Wars and Marvel talk about faith and how that connects to real life, I think could be a super interesting conversation, especially since I've heard her speak very eloquently on a number of other serious matters. So she would be a lot of fun. And my doctor is Christopher Eccleston, because that's who I started with. And I still think that's one of the very few examples of an almost perfect season of television. And the only time that I have cheered at the television without actually like actively intending to is when he did his final line when he was about to regenerate, and said that you were fantastic, Rose, and so was I. And it was really lovely. So, but yes, I also stopped with Peter Capaldi. So I will get back around to that again eventually. But Doctor Who is like really emotionally a lot. And I'm just not up for that right now.
Yeah, that is true. And I remember watching, there's a show that the BBC did that was like 50 years of the Doctor, is right on the 50th anniversary. And I was home in my like childhood home, maybe for Christmas break or something. And so I watched, they had like it was not a documentary, but it was like a movie of the beginning of Doctor Who and how it came to be, and like why they chose what types of, like why the Daleks were the way that they were, why the Cybermen were the way that they were, why they re-aired an episode because it didn't get big coverage because it was like right after Kennedy was shot, and so nobody was paying attention, and so they re-aired it because people needed to
understand how.
Yeah, and to have evil be something with no emotions, right? Like to have it be that we are battling against things that don't have emotions, and just kind of that relevancy and that way of speaking to what is happening in the world. I think Star Wars does a pretty good job of that too. There's always a different type of fascism that comes up, or X-Men did.
Yeah, absolutely. Funny how, fantasy and science fiction actually have a lot to say about politics and modern life.
Amazing. Yeah.
So kind of jumping off that conversation of like what you've been watching, one of my questions is, what are you reading right now? Like for fun, quote unquote. What are you reading?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Reading for fun, gracious. I think the most recent thing I really discovered, like brand new, was Shauna Maguire has this book series called the October Day series. The main character's name is October Day, and she's a private investigator who is also part fairy, and lives in San Francisco, and it is great fun, and I am following that series very carefully. But I have been trying to focus on professional reading lately because I haven't been doing as much of that, and mostly listening to podcasts for fun. So
I am still working my way through the audiobook for Bram Stoker's Dracula because I've never read it. And
are you doing the daily Dracula thing with the emails? or the?
No,
Okay.
I just checked it out from Libby, which
awesome.
is a thing that my library in Iowa is connected to, so I can just put my library card in, and Dracula is old enough that I can like check it out. There's no limits on how many times I can check it out or who, like all of that stuff. So I'll listen to it. I do Pulpit Supply a lot, and so it usually involves driving. I've done more Pulpit Supply in DC than I have in Baltimore, and so I'll like driving there. I'm like running my sermon through my head and stuff, and then on the way back, I just listen to an hour of Dracula every time I drive back. But then in like hard copy books, one of the Black Liberation Movement folks in Des Moines, who goes by Just Jaleisha, has a book of poetry that she came out with. So I've been reading my way through that. And like poetry by queer Black women in 2022 is a thing. So I've been reading that, and then also reading One Last Stop, which is a YA novel, young adult-ish novel. It's a like queer romance time travel thing. I haven't figured out what exactly the time travel is yet. I'm working my way slowly through that. And then I just finished Color Me In, which is a fantastic book about a biracial kid whose dad is Jewish and whose mom is Black and Christian. Dad is white and Jewish, Black and Christian, and like her navigating that in the middle of them getting divorced. And that was just like this really beautiful way of exploring the kind of intersections of religion and race and colorism and all of that stuff. And then I just started Juliet Takes a Breath, which is a phenomenal novel. And I just started the graphic novelization of it, the adaptation to a graphic novel. It's fantastic. I read Juliet Takes a Breath a while ago, and the graphic novel, it's really fun. So it's another queer young adult book. Most of my books are queer young adult books because that's what I do.
Follow up. It's a world that I probably should read more into. So the one reference that I always go to, have you read the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin?
No.
Oh.
I read The 100,000 Kingdoms by,
Okay. Yep.
is that the first one? I can never remember what
that's a different series of hers. Similar dynamics and stuff, but the Broken Earth trilogy, I love that series. I was wondering if you had a take on it, but oh man, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, I loved 100,000 Kingdoms. Again, kind of emotionally heavy, and so therefore at the moment I'm really focusing much more on like light and frothy stuff, just because there's so much going on in the world. But
I will definitely add it to my list. My TBR to be read list is, as you might imagine,
several miles long.
Huge, but it's on my list now. I think at some point I might give up on Dracula, and then I'll move through audiobooks a little bit more quickly. But
I'll explain the daily Dracula thing later. Okay. I think we just had one more question on our list.
Two more because I added one.
Oh.
But so we have two more, and then any others that you might have.
Yes, of course.
What is your favorite podcast memory?
Well, I definitely remember, like, I may not share at the TV much, but I have occasionally shared it emails, and several of those have been, we got them to be a guest on the podcast. They agreed. And so there have been a few of those. And other than that, there was, and I don't know if you'd remember this, Erin, since you're here, but we were trying to figure out what exactly it was before you got here. there was a moment on the podcast sometime last year when Emily said something along the lines of describing a horrible person in such a way that I could interpret it to understand that they were talking about me. And I said something along the lines of, well then, or I'm sorry to hear that, or excuse me, or something like that. And we both just completely broke down laughing. It was a beautiful moment. But my favorite part about that was that like 2 days later, I was editing the podcast and had somehow, speaking of things that you usually get edited out on the podcast, my lovely motorcycle neighbors, somehow I had completely forgotten that exchange ever happened. And so in the middle of doing my sound editing, which my husband is usually used to me being pretty dour doing, I broke out laughing, completely lost it. And he was a little concerned. And that was kind of fun. I really enjoy that memory, but I have no idea how we'd go about hunting it down because I don't have any memory of what like the reference you were making was at the time. It was just all about how you phrased the sentence. And so if anybody remembers that, 1,000 brownie points to you.
Yes. Gold stars all around. Yeah, I can't remember what it was. I think the whole podcast, like doing the podcast and recording the episodes is always fun.
Yes.
I particularly enjoyed, even though it was like significantly more work for both of us, especially UK, but I really enjoyed our Jesus Loves You series.
Yes, that was very fun.
Last summer on the Bread of Life readings. It was just so much fun to have like a series-ish, but also like to have fun with puns. And we had like Pace Warfield May, who is the main host / co-host of Horror Nerds at Church, did some like graphic designing with us too. And it's so much fun to have guests and to just like have it be a conversation and like, yeah.
I mean, really, the guests have been my favorite part of Nerds at Church ever since we switched from being HP at Church. Like 99.9% of them have been truly delightful and just a real joy. And the ones that weren't, tech issues happen. That's just a thing. There's nobody, you can't stop that. And there are like little moments that happen between us and the guests that no one else will ever get to hear because they weren't recorded that were really lovely. There is, of course, the much loved lost episode, which we will never hear again, which was one of our episodes with Jessica Davis. We did an Epiphany episode and there was a giant explosion basically in the tech world, and that
not an actual physical explosion.
No, but like there was
like
a disaster. And it wasn't anybody's fault, but it was a really good episode. Like all of Jess's episodes are awesome, but still. So that's definitely a favorite memory too.
Yeah, and our tech is like we occasionally have like a little bit of tech issues, but
we have learned from our mistakes and mostly figured out how not to do that again. So,
and now we have something where like we're not relying on guests to record their own audio, which is really helpful. It's part of that.
And so, of course, our final question has to be, who is your favorite Muppet? Sometimes I love my job. I
have two, because as is typical Emily fashion, I will not decide. I am non-binary.
I was going to say having two sounds
bisexual.
Like a false binary, but okay, sure.
I mean, when you're asked for one,
yeah,
I am too queer and non-binary and bisexual to have just one. My favorite Muppets, I have two. I love Cookie Monster, who will always be Cookie Monster no matter how many vegetables he eats. And when I was in high school and college, I think I actually had a shirt for Cookie Monster. But he's just like, he's fun and he enjoys life. Like he embodies the abundance that God is talking about with, right? Like, can you imagine the wedding at Cana?
It was cookies.
Cookie Monster.
I love that.
As Jesus. Right?
How has Cookie Monster not shown up more often in our
I
Muppet
don't
group?
know, but now he will.
Okay.
And then the other one is Oscar the Grouch. I had a stuffed animal, Oscar the Grouch, that was like, it was like stuffed animal / puppet type thing when I was a kid. And I like that there are grouchy Muppets, right? Like to have a model for not being happy all the time is really important.
And there's a, like, Eeyore does that a bit too in Winnie the Pooh,
Mhm.
but Eeyore is just sad, and Oscar the Grouch is actually grouchy, and that's important too.
I have my favorite children's book illustrator is Chris Roshta, who I know as like really know, not know of.
In the world.
Yeah, no, in the flesh, in the fleshy world. He and Bell Hooks have done some children's books together, and one of them that I think they did together was Grump Groan Growl, and it's all about like the emotions that we typically like discourage and the validity of them. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, my favorite Muppet, if you flash back briefly to the bit earlier where I said that I always expected to grow up to be a battle axe, and that was my, honestly, like that was my understanding of what feminine meant growing up. So my favorite was always Miss Piggy. She did not take any guff from anybody. She would karate chop you into submission if she had to. And she was very sure that she knew exactly what she wanted and how to go about getting it. And I love that. So. And she did genuinely love and care about her friends. She does still. She just has her own very particular ways of showing it.
Indeed, she does.
Yeah, but I believe we have run a tad over the time we were planning on.
Yes.
So
unless you have any last questions. Okay.
I mean, I could, but I want to respect your time, so don't worry about me. But yeah.
Yeah, this was fantastic, and
yes, thank you for joining
us.
us.
Yes, and now you can save them for about 3 months from now when we'll do our next live Q&A.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have one on sermon prep, but I thought that was too long of a question. So yeah.
Yes.
Actually, that's a great question for maybe the next time, because I don't know that we would do this, but I had briefly mentioned to Emily before we recorded. There's this format that Wired uses for some of their videos called the Explaining Something to 5 Levels. Can you explain it to a child, to a teenager, starting high school student, starting college student, graduate student, and an expert? That kind of sounds like the kind of question that might suit that format. So that might be really good for that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll save it for then. Cool.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. It's been,
especially those who are watching the recording.
Yes, our recording watchers and our live watcher participant. We will sign off as we always do. As the ancient Christians said, Pax Vobiscum.